Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Darien Library for an important program with author Amelia Pang and Dexter Tiff Roberts. Amelia is an award-winning journalist who received a first-place award for investigative journalism from the Los Angeles Press Club. She has written for Mother Jones and the New Republic. Amelia grew up in a Mandarin-speaking household and graduated from the New School. Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and The Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods is Amanda's first book. She lives outside Washington, D.C. with her husband, an organic farmer. Dexter Tiff Roberts is an award-winning writer and speaker on China, now serving as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Asia Security Initiative. Previously, he was the China Bureau Chief and Asia News Editor at Bloomberg Businessweek. He has reported from all of China's provinces and regions, including Tibet and Xinjiang. His first book was published in 2020, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World. Please put your questions in the Q&A field. We want to thank the Darien Friends for supporting these programs. We also want to thank our partners at Barrett's Books for stocking this book and making it available to all of you, both through the webpage and in person tomorrow. So with that, I will turn the program over to these two talented people, and you will hear a lot more things of interest tonight. Enjoy.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have a conversation with Amelia Pang about her new book, Made in China. It is a fascinating, thought-provoking, at times disturbing book, which I highly recommend that those of you in our audience, if you haven't purchased a copy and read it yet, you should do so after today's address. I just read it quite recently over the weekend, and I ended up staying. I read it in one go, not because it, mainly because it was so gripping, and I ended up staying up most of my Saturday night reading Made in China. So anyway, highly recommend that you purchase the book as well. Very pleased today, as I said, to be here with Amelia Pang. What we're going to do today is the two of us will have a conversation about her book, but then we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions for all of you who are joining tonight for later in the program. I believe we have 1 hour tonight. So I'm going to jump right into it. Amelia, could you tell us about the story of how you came to write this book, and also a bit about the two protagonists, if you will, of Made in China, people from very, very different backgrounds. One, a Chinese man named Sun Yi, and a woman living outside of Portland, Oregon, I believe, Julie Keith, and how their paths came to cross.
Yes, thank you, Dexter. So I first heard about this story at the same time the world did, when this message, this SOS letter that was found in a Kmart product went viral in the news media. Yeah, like you said, an American woman named Julie Keith. She's this kind of ordinary consumer. She's a mother of 2 young children. She was actually planning a Halloween party for one of her kids and decided to look through her shed for some decorations and came across something that had been sitting in storage for about 2 years because it was something that had been purchased because it was just incredibly cheap, but she didn't really have a use for it, really. And so when she finally had an opportunity to open it 2 years later, she was shocked to find that this whole time there was an SOS letter waiting for her. It was written by a political prisoner in China named Sun Yi, who had made and packaged this very product in a labor camp. So my book tells his story, how he landed in a labor camp, and more importantly, what are the factors and the problems in our supply chain that make it really easy for something that was manufactured in a labor camp in Liaoning, China, to end up selling at a Kmart in Portland, Oregon.
Obviously, the most much of the shocking detail of your book revolves around these reform through labor camps, which, as it turns out, I guess it's hard to gauge how much, but a portion of what we buy in our stores is still produced in these reform through labor, almost this gulag of prisons that have forced labor for their workers, and as you illustrate in the book, are producing goods for some of the biggest labels in the world and some of the biggest retailers that some or all of us have been to at one point or another. Can you tell us a little bit about reform through labor in China? You look in your book not just at what it looks like today, but a bit at how it came about and how it's changed over the years.
Right. These labor camps have had all kinds of names and variations over the years. The first, forced labor has existed in ancient China as well as it did in many parts of the world. There was corvée labor in ancient China, but this kind of mass arrests of political enemies and using them for forced labor, this really started with the Chinese Communist Party as early on as the 1930s, when they were starting to gain momentum and take over certain areas of China. And since they've taken over, it's gradually expanded to become a very large system. And these camps were originally based off of Soviet gulags, and the conditions to this day are still very horrific, not so different from Soviet gulags. There's a lot of torture. Not everyone there are political dissidents, but a lot of political dissidents end up in these camps because they're a really kind of easy and efficient way for the Chinese government to silence dissent and to prevent dissent from spreading. There's many different types of camps with different names, but the author of this particular SOS letter was in a re-education through labor camp, which, like many of these facilities, is an extralegal detention center where all the detainees are in there without ever having gone through a trial. They usually don't have access to a lawyer. It's very hard for them to get a lawyer, even if they have family on the outside trying to help them. And they have to work around 15 to 20 hours a day. It's pretty much unpaid labor. They're not really paid for their work at all. Maybe they'll make $1 a month, roughly, but a lot of that money gets taken out to pay for, maybe food and taking care of the injuries that they experience in the camps and things like that. It's pretty torturous conditions. Yes, the political detainees are often tortured and go through excessive and very extreme forms of brainwashing. But even detainees who are not necessarily political prisoners are often brutally beaten for not working fast enough to meet what is essentially our production deadlines, our company's production deadlines, in order to make it possible for some of these Chinese suppliers to manufacture products at the pace that they do. And yes, these are really brutal places where also in the women's camps, the sexual violence is very prevalent in the women's camps, and amid these conditions, they a lot of times are manufacturing our goods and not just the cheap goods.
I imagine this is a difficult number to come by, but do we have a sense of how many of these camps there are that are involved in forced labor? And is there any geographical focus within China, or would they be more spread across the country wherever prisons are?
They're really spread across the entire country, but one region that we're seeing with a massive spike in these types of forced labor facilities is Xinjiang. As I'm sure many of the listeners are aware, as we see through the satellite imagery, the camps are expanding at a pretty fast rate. Actually, they're arresting the Turkic minorities there, the Uyghurs and Kazakhs, at such a rapid pace that they can't build enough camps to hold them all. They're transferring a lot of them out through what's known as the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program to other types of forced labor facilities throughout China. It's hard to say exactly how many of these facilities are out there, because China the Chinese government doesn't release us any kind of comprehensive data that we can trust. So a lot of times you are relying on individual organizations or journalists to try to piece together the puzzle, but it is a pretty significant number. Pretty much every type of detention center, most of them do have forced labor.
I did see reports as well recently that as well as the well-documented and human rights tragedy that's happening, as you mentioned, in Xinjiang with the ethnic Muslim Uyghurs mainly, and the fact that, as you say, many of them, even as they've been in some cases taken out of what the Chinese call re-education camps, they've been put into factories where they're doing work. And obviously the worry is that is forced labor. And there's been reports as well that this has happened in Tibet with Tibetans. Yeah, yes.
Yes, there's been reports of that as well. I mean, it's a lot of ethnic minorities have actually historically been detained in these types of facilities, or sometimes arbitrarily even sentenced to prison, and where they also have to do manufacturing work for long hours every day and experience the same level of brutality. No, it's not really a new phenomenon, unfortunately, but it is expanding, and the scope and the scale is it's much larger now.
Could you tell us a bit about Sunni, the individual who wrote that SOS letter? He's obviously part of a religious group called the Falun Gong, which has faced a level of persecution in China. Maybe you could tell us about him and about them as well, what they've experienced, those of them with those within China.
Yeah, Sunni is a really fascinating character. He grew up in this kind of initially this really rural area where there wasn't a whole lot of resources for the kids, but he was incredibly smart. He loved to read. He was very curious about the world. He got a scholarship to go to university and studied engineering, and he went to college during the 80s, where he became really interested in Western thoughts. Like he loved to read Hegel, for example. And so he was kind of this really interesting intellectual figure who eventually had some issues with depression and got involved in the religious group Falun Gong, and kind of really found his meaning and identity through the group. And that was what led him to end up in a labor camp. So the Falun Gong group does have this kind of unique ability to organize large protests. That's kind of rare in China. You're seeing that with Hong Kong and in parts that's not quite as tightly controlled by the Chinese government. You can see those kinds of where free information can kind of disseminate. you can see more of that kind of protest happening. But in mainland China, it's very hard because the risk is so high. If you try to organize anything that is remotely similar to the 1989 protests with that kind of large numbers, then you're instantly going to, your group is instantly going to be cracked down on, which is what happened to Falun Gong. They had organized a 10,000 person, protest in 1999, and that pretty soon led to the ban of Falun Gong. And since then, they've taken on this kind of pro-democracy activism in China, really fighting for a freer China, and that has led to a lot of their followers ending up in these types of facilities. And so I really wanted to show the human stories of the people in these camps. So I try to show, Suni's childhood, what he was like as a human being, and how once he ended up in one of these camps, he just gradually unraveled, not just his body, but also his mind and his spirit. And he went from this man who used to contemplate Hegel to this mechanism in a factory where he just did these repetitive motions every day, and slowly kind of withered away, and as well as all of his relationships in his life, and that was the cost of this incredibly cheap decoration from Kmart.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned also the human cost, the family cost. He ended up being separated from his wife. That's right. And did he not go in and out of prison over a number of years?
Yes, he was in and out a lot, like many dissidents in China. And yeah, I do try to tell the love story between him and his wife, because it is a very sweet connection that they had, and a precious connection that managed to survive so much. They had met in college and they fell in love, but due to China's complicated hukou system, it wasn't so easy for them to be able to, which is the household registration system. It wasn't easy for them to actually get married and live together and both work in the same city. But they managed to accomplish that against all odds and be together. And after all these years of kind of waiting to be together, they're finally able to get married. But then he gets involved in this pro-democracy movement that lands him in prison throughout most of their marriage, unfortunately.
Now, you were not actually able to meet him, is that right? Can you tell a little bit about how you given that constraint with him in China and in and out of prison, how you as a reporter and a writer got to know so much about him? Because I must say you do a wonderful job of giving the reader a picture of this man, Suni.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I interviewed him on Skype and multiple times, and I really tried to ask him about the sensory details of his experiences. What was it? What were the smells in the camp? What were the sights and textures and sounds? To really try to take readers inside these facilities. And he was actually filming most during his later years in China to try to work on a documentary, which later got published as Letter from Xinjiang, I believe it's called. And so if people want to see him and what he looked like and how he interacted with the world, it's in the documentary. So I actually had access to a lot of footage of him filming himself going about his day in China after he was able to leave the camp, and doing his secretive activism work. And you could kind of piece together a lot of details about him through a lot of the footage.
Now, the other person, of course, that you focus in on is Julie Keith. You also do a wonderful job of talking about her experience, this dilemma, where she discovers this note. She's she's overwhelmed by the reality that there may be this prisoner who's trying to reach out for help. She doesn't necessarily get a lot of support in the home. I think it's fair to say her husband is a little bit dismissive. He's afraid of the attention of trying to deal with this. Sunni, whomever he may be, is far away. They've never met, but she persists. Could you talk a little bit about her and what kind of a person she is, and why she did persist in trying to get to the bottom of this SOS note in this person?
Yeah, she's kind of emblematic of just the average American consumer. She's just a mom who, after work, she has a lot of responsibilities. She's taking care of her kids, and she receives this letter from this political prisoner who had made her product, and it completely kind of unravels her world in its own way. She, first of all, doesn't, like most people, if they receive such a letter, wouldn't know what to do. Who do you even contact to get help for this man? She called a number of human rights organizations, but it was difficult to actually reach anyone or get any kind of concrete advice about what to do. Later on, I think Human Rights Watch ended up responding and saying, yes, this letter does seem consistent with other reports we've seen from survivors of these camps, but did not really offer any concrete steps as to how to identify him or get help for him. She tried to contact the US government, which also, she actually even met with ICE, because they're actually the department that's in charge of investigating forced labor internationally when it comes to products that are manufactured and ending up in our stores. But wasn't really, she came across a lot of roadblocks, but she never wanted to give up. She tried everything she could, because I think so often as consumers, it's easy, and I do too, it's easy to separate the human rights abuses, is probably had to have happened in order for us to get a certain product for that low of a price or for that quick of a turnaround. But if we never meet or know the people who did this type of work in other parts of the world, then it's hard for it to really resonate for us to want to be compelled to take any action. But here Julie was connected with a man who was in some grave danger and for manufacturing her products, and she wanted to change and wanted to take action, and I think that's ultimately what my goal for this book is, to really humanize and show the different types of detainees, their life stories, how they end up in these camps, what were their lives before they got stuck in these places manufacturing our goods.
And as you point out in your book, this was by no means the only SOS letter that appeared in American homes or in American stores over recent years, right? This has been a pretty common. This has happened a lot.
Yeah, this happens surprisingly a lot. I think the earliest one was in the 90s. It was written by a pro-democracy activist named Chin Po Kong. He was in a southern labor camp where they manufactured artificial flowers. And by day, they were actually working at a quarry carrying stones, and it was quite dangerous. A lot of workers got injured, and then at night they had to stay up gluing these artificial flowers that had really toxic fumes. and they weren't allowed to sleep there for very long. They'd just keep manufacturing these artificial flowers with American labels. I think one label said Springfield, Illinois, and he could read some English, so he knew that this was going to the US, and if he wanted to tell the world what he was experiencing while he was still alive to do it, this was his only opportunity, is to get a letter to Springfield, Illinois. So he actually snuck the labels, the English labels, with the letter, and it eventually, after passing through a number of hands, arrived at a human rights organization in the U.S., and that got publicized widely. And that was actually one of the rare cases in the beginning where it led to a ban of a product, because it was hard evidence that this particular distributor was buying products from a labor camp in China. The distributor's tag was literally mailed with the letter. But a lot of times, unfortunately, we hear about these types of letters, we hear about these stories, and there's a lot of media publicity. Sometimes there's even a congressional hearings, but it rarely leads to any kind of meaningful action, whether it's on the corporate side or the legal side, because it's easy for people in power to say, "Oh, we don't have enough hard evidence to change anything," and that's why to this day there's still forced labor products entering our ports, decades after the first letter was discovered.
One of the very interesting parts in your book is when you talk about the very complicated and sometimes very corrupt global auditing industry, which is used by the multinationals, the retailers, and the big brands to try to at least sort of put a clean label of service on their production lines. And of course, they use it to try to determine whether things like forced labor are happening amongst their suppliers. And more broadly, of course, they use it to look for any kind of labor abuses or environmental abuses. As you show very vividly, often that simply just does not work, that auditing process. Can you talk about that?
Right. A lot of times these audits are designed to protect the corporation when a scandal happens, rather than actually protecting the workers. Most of these audits are not designed to detect subcontracting to forced labor camps. Yeah, I've spoken with Chinese auditors who say, I've been an auditor for a really long time, many years, some of them decades, and they say, throughout my entire career, I know that a lot of these factories use prison labor. It's very common in the industry, but I've never been able to prove it due to the way that we do audits. There's many different types of audits. A lot of them are the cheaper kinds, where they're pretty cursory. That they might look for things like the quality of the product, the quality of the merchandise, the cleanliness of the factory. These audits are cheaper, so they typically cost a couple $100, and they're really not comprehensive enough to detect something like secret subcontracting to labor camps. And then you have more expensive social compliance audits that will interview workers and look at a couple more things, that those might cost $1,000 or more. But auditors have told me even those cannot detect hidden subcontracting to labor camps. The only types of audits that may be able to detect it is this much more expensive audit that takes 3 days to conduct, and the auditor really cross-analyzes waged documents in multiple departments. And since it's a much pricier audit, I don't know how many corporations are actually conducting this type of audit to determine if forced labor is happening in their supply chain. Because at this rate, most companies don't actually reveal what kind of an audit they're conducting, what they look for in their audits, what they found in their audits, how much they paid for their audits, how much they're paying their factories, or how much time they're giving their factories to make these products. A lot of these key factors that could be red flags as to whether a factory is using forced labor or not is not really revealed in most sustainability pages or so-called corporate social responsibility pages.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of resistance amongst the big multinationals for many years to even release their supplier lists. Some companies started to do that. It was a bit of a breakthrough. They initially treated it, of course, as sort of a corporate secret, and they said that it would hurt their competitiveness if they revealed who they were sourcing from. But as you say, we're not necessarily talking about suppliers. We're talking about sub-suppliers or sub-sub-suppliers, and of course with the prison labor, maybe several levels down in terms of supplying. So there is a challenge there. And yet you do talk in your book about cases where the use of prison labor has been demonstrated, or products from prison labor, simply by following trucks that would be carrying goods out of these prison factories. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, during my reporting for this book, I went to China, and I actually visited a detention center that was a reopened re-education through labor camp. China said they closed our re-education through labor camps, but they're all pretty much drug detox centers now. And I went to one of these drug detox centers, and even the guards, they still call this place a prison. They don't call it a drug detox center. And I spent a lot of time following the trucks that left this facility, to see exactly which manufacturers they're working with. And they're working with all kinds of exporters, including an Apple factory, official Apple factory that's listed on their supplier list. And the relationship, it's not hidden in a way. Like, if I, as an individual journalist, can find this out, a corporation with millions of dollars to spend on audits can definitely find out more than what I was able to if they really wanted to look. Because if you talk to the guards at the camps, they acknowledge this is a forced labor. They acknowledge that there's prisoners inside working, and that they can sell goods overseas if you're a company wanting to buy from them. If you just take the time to ask questions and to look, the system is not actually even hidden very well. So I've heard social compliance experts suggest that maybe one of the only ways to detect and deter factories from subcontracting work to a labor camp is to just simply rewrite the contract to say that you may be sending people periodically unannounced, without the factory's knowledge, to follow the trucks that leave this factory, to see exactly which suppliers are they working with. Are they working with authorized factories that are of good working conditions and good quality? Or are they working with a bunch of prisons and detention centers and other types of extralegal forced labor facilities? If you just follow the trucks, you can see, and that's important, because it will basically cost the company no money to just slightly revise the contract to add this line. And it sends a very different message to their suppliers in China. Because right now, what companies basically say is, oh, we don't tolerate any types of prison or forced labor in the supply chain. But we're really not going to find out if you use this type of labor. We're really not going to look very hard. So that's the big hole that needs to be filled.
You mentioned something there that jumped out, the fact that in many cases now, these are drug rehabilitation centers, at least that's what they're called. So you're saying that in this case, we have people that are drug addicts or recovering drug addicts who are now being forced to produce these goods, and this has become a major source of forced labor.
Yes, it's wild. Actually, Human Rights Watch did a terrific investigation about that's just on the drug detox centers, and found that most of them are reopened re-education through labor camps, and they offer no services to actually help people with addiction. They don't offer any mental health services. It's all just purely manufacturing work, under still very torturous conditions.
Wow. I think a very important part of your book is when you talk about the role that we as consumers play in this, and you talk about how the rise of fast fashion has actually made the situation far, far worse within China for forced labor. Can you talk about, again, just present that part of your book, and how, what role do all of us play in consuming sometimes eagerly these cheap products? And what role does the fashion industry play in this as well?
Yeah, the fashion industry is definitely a big culprit, although it's definitely not the only industry. I don't think there's really any industry that's completely safe from Chinese forced labor. But the fashion industry in particular is a big issue. Let's say a company like Kmart or H&M or Walmart, they put in an order for 10,000 black hats. But then all of a sudden, a celebrity in the US starts wearing lime green hats. So now everybody wants to change their order to lime green to meet the latest trends, because we as consumers love to buy trendy products for incredibly cheap prices. And we may already have 20 hats, but we don't have a lime green hat. So, and now Kim Kardashian's wearing it, or just an example. I don't know if she wears lime green hats, but now there's a bunch of people that are going to want to buy it. So these companies are going to have to make a very rapid change in their production order. And a lot of times they're not going to give their factory enough time to make the change. This is fast fashion. And a lot of times the factories face a very, very high penalty if they miss the deadline for reasons that are not their fault. The penalty is so high that they're basically paying the company to take their product from them. They're not making any kind of profit to pay their workers, or pay their operating costs. So a lot of factories, when they just simply are not given enough time to make the product, they kind of have no choice but to outsource work to some really shady places like labor camps. And when the price they're offered to make these products is so low that they cannot realistically make it in-house or make it at a good factory that is actually paying workers properly, then they have to outsource work to some really shady places like labor camps, where detainees are not paid, and they can work 15 to 20 hours a day to get that fast production deadline met. And this problem is getting worse and worse with the rise of what's known as ultra fast fashion now, which is even faster. With the rise of these types of online retailers that don't have any brick and mortar stores, they can shorten the production and distribution time even more. So with companies like the name Fashion Nova, for example, the CEO of Fashion Nova has famously said to the New York Times that they can turn something from a design into actual clothing in the CEO's office in less than 24 hours. And when an ultra fast fashion company like Fashion Nova, which is incredibly popular, they have these partnerships with celebrities like Cardi B and the Kardashians. They're incredibly popular, profitable brand that is just able to produce the latest trends at extremely fast pace. Then that pushes everybody else in the fashion industry to try to shorten their production time even more to match with that competitive edge that Fashion Nova has. So what you're really seeing is the time between design, production, and distribution is shortening and shortening even more. And that just creates more incentives for Chinese suppliers to outsource work to labor camps, because it's not always the situation where, oh, there's just these Chinese suppliers that are being really greedy and unethical and they don't care about ethical working conditions. A lot of times it's us as Western companies that give our Chinese suppliers really high standards about operating a facility that pays their workers minimum wage and has good environmental standards. But we're not really setting up our factories in China to succeed in meeting those standards with the prices that we're offering and the time that we're actually giving them to make these products. So that's just some big inconsistencies in what we say and our actual business policies in China that need to become more aligned. And that does, I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to rely on consumers to take action to force our corporations to be more responsible.
That actually, I'd like to start turning to our audience questions, and that brings us very naturally to one of the first, which was, what can we do as consumers to make a difference?
Yeah, I would say the next time you go shopping online at your favorite brand store, just take a moment to look at their sustainability page or their corporate social responsibility page and see exactly what it says. Are they revealing how much they pay their factories? Are they paying their factories enough money so that the factory can actually make the product and have real workers that are there on their free will and paid properly to make them? Or is the company not revealing their prices because they are giving an incredibly low price to the factory and they have no choice but outsource work to force laborers to get the job done? These sustainability pages should also be revealing the time that they give their factories to make the products, and a couple other things that I mentioned in my book that you should be looking for in these sustainability pages. And if you see that your favorite brand is not meeting these standards, we need to start calling them out on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter. Because I think we do have a lot of blood on our hand as consumers, because we are supporting companies that can offer the latest trends and the cheapest prices. And these are fundamental factors that contribute to making it really easy for Chinese suppliers to outsource work to labor camps.
It sounds like yours is a call for all of us to become much better educated about the actual products we're consuming. I think that's a great piece of advice, obviously, to look at those consumer those CSR pages within the corporate and see actually what they tell us they are doing. So I think that's very important. Another question from the audience: is there a correlation between the rise of capitalism in China and the labor detention camps?
With each period of economic growth, yeah, there's definitely been an expansion of labor camps. I've heard some people say, if the factories actually had real labor unions where workers could freely organize, that it would be a lot harder for factories to outsource work to labor camps, because it does hurt the workers when the factories have this option to outsource work to incredibly cheap places. So you could argue there's some connection there.
Do we have a sense of whether, as an overall phenomena, whether the use of prison labor in our products is increasing today, or not?
Excuse me. My sense is that it is increasing, because the camps in Xinjiang alone are increasing, and that region is a huge trade route for China. uh, Xinjiang is of huge strategic importance to China because it's a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this $1 trillion economic development strategy, and Xinjiang really is a key part of that because it connects China to the Middle East, it connects China to Europe, it also connects China to Central Asia, and it's kind of an area that's received so much economic development that it's too big. It's received so much funds that it's too big to fail. Excuse me. With a lot of the rises in economic development, you're seeing a rise in the crackdown on the Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities in the region. So unfortunately, a lot of the products in Xinjiang are exported. We're seeing some action, legislative efforts on the part of the U.S. to ban certain types of products in Xinjiang that are known to be heavily associated with forced labor, like tomato products and cotton products. But those are by far not the only types of products that are being exported out of Xinjiang. Xinjiang makes raw materials for solar panels, for example. And I just, as China becomes more and more of an economic powerhouse, as more countries become intricately tied to China economically through the Belt and Road Initiative, I think we're definitely going to see even more of a rise with the amount of forced labor goods that are being exported.
Another question, which you've just begun to touch on, what is the international response, or what should be the international response to these labor camps? I'm thinking on a state-to-state basis. We have some of the top Biden officials meeting this week in Anchorage, Alaska, with some of the top Chinese foreign policy officials. And they've said that they will talk about Xinjiang. The US officials have said that. What do you think is the proper state-to-state response that might actually go some way towards controlling or limiting this human rights tragedy?
Yeah, well, the US, Canada, and the Netherlands have already said that they recognize what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as a genocide. Rightfully so, because there's hard evidence that China's strategies towards the Uyghur, there's an intent to destroy. And it actually has led to a significant decrease in the Uyghur population already and their birth rates. So the correct response is for countries globally to band together and call out China for engaging in a genocide, and to even potentially boycott the Olympics in China. But not many countries are actually doing so because, as we mentioned earlier, China has invested a lot of money in a lot of countries overseas, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's why most countries, especially the Muslim countries who should be outraged by what's happening to the Uyghurs, are pretty much silent about this issue.
So another audience question, what about the organ market in China? Are these camps supplying organs, human organs too?
Yes, there's in last year, actually 2 years ago in 2019, the China Tribunal in London, which consists of this independent panel of doctors, human rights lawyers, and other medical experts, they looked at all the evidence and concluded there was proof beyond reasonable doubt that prisoners of conscience in these camps were being killed for their organs. It's just not medically possible for China to produce that many fresh organ matches at the rate that they're able to produce them. It does not match with the natural birth and death rates. And the organ and trade industry is $1 billion a year trade industry in China, and it's unfortunately the prison camps are a huge source for that trade.
What do you think is the reason why there hasn't been more reporting, sort of smoking gun reporting on organ harvesting in China? We've had tremendously powerful reporting with reporters, journalists in China, foreign journalists going to great lengths to report what is happening in the camps in Xinjiang, for example. But we really haven't seen the similar attention paid to this, what you say is a pretty widespread organ harvesting. What are your thoughts on why we haven't seen more reporting on this?
I think it just sounds so horrific. It almost sounds like a conspiracy theory. And I think a lot of, I think there's definitely, just similar to how we were initially really reluctant to talk about what was happening in Xinjiang as well. We were reluctant to call these places concentration camps. We were very careful with our terminology. I think a lot of times as Western journalists, we don't want to raise red flags and come off as conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theorists. We want to, really take the time to get multiple sources to verify things. But unfortunately, for these types of issues, a lot of times it is hard to get information out, and there isn't a whole lot of survivors that are willing to talk on the record. So I think all of these can play a role in making it hard to do reporting.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience: are these prison labor camps owned by the government?
A lot of them are state-run, yes. Actually, most of them are state-run, and they're even subsidized by the state. Because these camps are not all of them are lucrative. A lot of them are managed by the police rather than actual business people who know how to run a business. So they may not. A lot of them do tend to need a lot of funding from the state to survive, and the state continues to do that because it's an incredibly useful tool for the Chinese government to silence and control dissent.
Do you know of other countries that currently employ forced labor? If this is a global occurrence, what are the international organizations that are successful at combating this?
Yes, there's forced labor is definitely an issue. That's not, China is not the only culprit. There are some great organizations who are doing work to address this. One of them is called Freedom United. You can check out their website. It's called freedomunited.org. They do a lot of advocacy work to address forced labor and slavery, modern slavery throughout the world. And as to specifically the Uyghur forced labor situation, there's a lot of Uyghur human rights groups that are doing great work as well. One of them is called the Uyghur Human Rights Project. You can look up those organizations as well for more resources on campaigns that you can support and steps you can take to try to hold our corporations accountable.
Can you talk about your experience visiting these detention camps? I think, and this question, I think I know the answer to. How did the Chinese government feel about you investigating?
But they didn't know that I was there because I went on a tourism visa. Yeah, I was told I was warned actually by other journalists in China, foreign correspondents, not to go on a journalism visa because I wasn't going to be able to get much reporting done unless you have a lot of resources and a lot of experience to know how to trick the police from following you. And so when I went on a tourism visa, I was able to go off the radar and just walk towards the camp and pass as a ordinary kind of business person looking to purchase products from these camps, and really have a in-depth conversation with a lot of these guards at these camps to get more information about what types of products they're manufacturing, how willing they were to work with an overseas company, even though it was technically illegal for them to export these types of goods, even according to Chinese law. But all of them, for the most part, agreed to outsource, export the products that they made. I also spent a lot of time calling these camps, and pretty much all of them had a sales department that they would transfer me to that agreed to sell the products to overseas. So again, it's a system that's not hidden very well if you actually want to try to look.
Yeah, it sounds, the way you described it earlier, you've got these suppliers that almost have like a blacklist of who they can turn to if they get hit with one of these, a lime green hat order that needs to be, as you said, needs to be met very, twice as quickly as usual. So it's almost as if it's an open secret. Is that a correct characterization?
Yeah, I've actually talked to Chinese factory managers about this issue, and they say, I don't understand why you're writing about this. It's not a secret. It's not a secret that Chinese suppliers can use prison labor. They don't see it as forced labor.
A follow-up question on that process of investigating in China. With what has transpired, are you concerned with your safety? I guess it sounds like this question is actually asking right now as well, but I'm interested, at the time, were you concerned with your safety, and if you have any concerns today?
At the time, I was concerned because, again, I was on a tourism visa, which doesn't quite have as much protections as a journalism visa if you get arrested. But I figured, since I was an American citizen, I've never been a Chinese national. I was actually born in the U.S. and grew up here. So that fact alone offered me a lot of more protection than a Chinese national who was doing this type of reporting. And also the fact that I am of Chinese descent, that I can kind of walk up to these facilities and just kind of blend in and not raise too many red flags compared to if a Western journalist, like a white person, were to show up at these camps. I'd imagine it'd be harder for them to open up about what actually went on inside. So I was nervous about getting caught still, because at the time it seemed like U.S.-China relations were rapidly deteriorating. In 2019, there was a trade war, and who knows, you could at any point end up as a pawn in the trade war. Even China could potentially start arresting Americans and trying to hold them hostage so that the U.S. government can maybe negotiate more preferable terms for trade. I don't know. It was all within the realm of possibility. So I was a bit nervous, but luckily, and nobody actually realized I was there to do reporting, and I managed to go off the radar. And yeah, everything was fine in the end. Am I still scared? Not really. In the U.S., I think I'm probably fine. I think I would be more nervous if we were having in-person events, and because I know there's a lot of Chinese trolls on Twitter that are attacking me. And who knows, they could potentially show up in real life and maybe not be very happy with me. But No, I think especially with these virtual events, I'm not very scared. Sorry, that's a really long-winded way to answer your question.
Yeah, as I'm sure you're well aware, we've seen some Chinese dissidents resident in the United States being harassed at their homes. Certainly, Teng Biao, you mentioned in your book, is
Right.
one example, in a very, very disturbing way, with large numbers of people showing up to harass and stand outside his house and yell at him and his family.
Yes, yes, that was very sad. And it carried on for such a long time too. I'm not as prominent as Teng Biao, so nobody has come to my house so far. Fingers crossed.
Okay, well, maybe this might be one of our last questions. This is also from the audience. Are you going to continue researching this topic? Do you think you would investigate this issue in other countries as well?
I think there's definitely a lot to investigate for other countries as well. I would like to see that book. I don't know if I'm going to be the person to write it, but definitely as more companies pull out of China and move to even cheaper countries to get manufacturing work done, like Mexico and a lot of African countries. As China's Belt and Road Initiative develops, there's bound to be a lot of disturbing labor issues connected with more and more of our products, as we see more variations of labels. Just because it's not made in China doesn't mean it's better quality with better working conditions. But I don't think I'm going to be the one to write that book. I think what I would like to cover next is more about what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, because I'm partly of Uyghur descent, and working on this book has really sparked my interest and regret in not learning more about my heritage earlier on when we were still able to go to Xinjiang.
Yeah, I should note, if you aren't, that you wrote a powerful piece for the New York Times on this topic, which I actually read before I knew that I was going to be doing your book event. So to the audience, take a look at that as well, because it's quite powerful piece by Amelia.
Wow.
So well, thank you very, very much. This has been absolutely fascinating about a topic that is very important and relevant for all of us here in the United States and around the world. So it looks like I can hand it back to Kathleen.
Hi, thank you both so much. That was fascinating. And I know we could go on for hours with more questions, but you've certainly created a seed of curiosity in everyone that's been listening. Please remember Barrett Bookstore has these books. You can order them through them on the web tonight, or you can stop by tomorrow. It is really worth reading, and you will not stop turning the pages. So thank you both for joining us tonight. It was great. And hopefully we'll see you soon, and we'll see you for your book one day. Night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate
Thank you.
Darien Library. Hope everyone supports local bookstores, and definitely check out Tiff's book as well.
Yep.
It's such an incredible honor to do an event with him. Thank you everyone for your time.
Bravo, both of you. Thank you.